Howdy, my name is Mark Tomberdahl. I am from Cortical Metrics, and this talk is about how we take a look at the measures that you've collected either on yourself or on someone else. This is all assuming that you use the brain gauge to collect a couple of metrics. And if you have done so, you've collected a typical battery, which is multiple measures. And these measures were designed to target either specific mechanisms and or specific neural pathways. And what's the way to think about a specific mechanism and how you're actually targeting it is you think of this test as being a non-invasive biopsy. And if you sort of think about taking a slice of the brain out and testing it exhaustively, then you would think that, well, you'd probably be able to tell if something went wrong with the brain. If something happens to the entire brain, you can just take a look at that one slice. Now, regular invasive biopsy, like a liver biopsy, assumes everything in the liver is acting the same, and you take a slice out of that and take a look at that tissue. Non-invasive means we're not cutting anything open. Well, anyway, your typical test battery might be composed of amplitude discrimination, timing perception, temporal order judgment, reaction time. And these all test different features of information processing, different things that the brain does. And like I said, these systemic alterations impact all parts of the brain. And their measures are focused on CNS information processing mechanisms, and they're sensitive to systemic changes. Now, pathway testing, a little different, and this is the part of the brain here that receives the input from the brain gauge, but it also can send those inputs places like the cerebellum. And different measures are sensitive to changes in these different regions. So if we were to look at a measure like timing perception, that is affected very much by how well the cerebellum is working. If the cerebellum's damaged, then that whole pathway is damaged. Likewise, another pathway influences temporal order judgment. Now, these are two timing measures that are somewhat different in that the cerebellum impacts the how long pathway, which is known as timing perception, and the when pathway, or temporal order judgment, is a whole different measure. Now, what we want to do is combine all the measures, and both pathway specific and mechanism specific all into one chart. And when we do that, if you take enough measures, then you start to get a fairly complete CNS profile. And so if you look, here's one measure, the amplitude discrimination goes into the accuracy metric. TOJ goes into the TOJ metric here. Timing percept is right here. And so all these things combine to make a nice profile. And the values that you see that are above this dotted line reflect how the user did on the tests. The values below this line are derived from computations about relationships between the different metrics. And then the data is plotted both in length and in color. So green would be very good, red would be bad, and we start out up here at the top looking at poor results. Then here we have mixed results because you have a couple of scores that came out all green. And good results are typically what it looks like when you have all the results are good. One way that researchers are using these displays to see how well cortical metrics tracks recovery of individuals from concussion. This is an active area of research, and we're currently at over 30 sites doing this. Cortical metrics are compared to other measures being commonly used. So let's take a look at some of those. SCAT is one of the other measures that we compare to, and in this case we're comparing to day 2, day 9, day 16, and then 3 months post-recovery. But in this case, day 2, they had a SCAT score of 11 and a SCAT score of 3 on day 9, and then symptom-free on day 16. So you see a bit of a correlation between, or a crude correlation between the higher the SCAT score, the worse the cortical metrics are. And once the subject's symptom-free, you also see a trend towards better recovery. 3 months post-recovery on this subject, symptoms or headaches returned. They were tested again, and it's clear enough that they obviously, that was consistent with cortical metrics evaluation. Next example shows the individual recovering from the first concussion, and then he suffered a second concussion. And so day 2 and day 16, that was sort of looked like a typical recovery. The second concussion occurred a month later, but it took a lot longer to get to full recovery. And so while these numbers don't look all that bad, the symptoms lingered, and it took up to 4 months before that recovery. Third example is one where the individual is non-compliant with their concussion protocol. In other words, this person, 2 days, 5 days, and 10 days, they showed just a natural progression towards recovery. But in between day 10 and day 15, they engaged in some activities which would be considered non-compliant with concussion recovery. Clinical researchers are assessing cortical metrics to determine if they're good indicators of treatment efficacy. And what we mean by treatment efficacy is if a patient gets tested and they're symptomatic of some neurological condition and they're treated, will cortical metrics reflect a positive treatment? So we have 4 examples in this page showing pre-treatment versus post-treatment on 4 different patients who are treated by 4 different clinicians for 4 different neurological conditions. In each case, the cortical metrics appears to reflect the improvements that those patients experienced in their condition. If you want to learn more about cortical metrics and the brain gauge, visit us at corticalmetrics.com.